It started with a click, a digital arrangement on a website, promising luxury, love, and something in between. But what unfolded next would send shockwaves through the highest echelons of Hollywood. David Geffen, the entertainment mogul behind DreamWorks, Geffen Records, and billion-dollar philanthropy, was no stranger to fame or power. With an estimated net worth of $9 billion and institutions like UCLA and Lincoln Center bearing his name, he was hailed not only as a media kingmaker, but also as a cultural savior. To the public, Geffen was untouchable. But in May 2024, headlines splashed across national media, exposed a side of the billionaire few could have imagined. His estranged husband, David Armstrong, known also by his alias Donovan Michaels, filed a 33-page civil lawsuit accusing Geffen of grooming, psychological abuse, and breaking oral promises of lifelong financial support. Behind the lawsuit was a chilling narrative. A young man from the foster care system lured into a cycle of dependency, emotional subjugation, and isolation, all masked by the glamour of private yachts, red carpets, and opulent mansions. According to Michaels, this wasn't a love story gone wrong. It was a masterclass in manipulation by a man who allegedly used his wealth and influence to buy obedience, affection, and control. From an initial $10,000 one-night arrangement to years of being at Geffen's beck and call, Michaels claims he was never truly seen as an equal, only as a possession. Then came the marriage. No prenuptial agreement, no written contract, just whispered promises of lifelong partnership and shared wealth. And then sudden abandonment, eviction from their Manhattan apartment. Financial support severed, left with no assets, no money, and a story that the world was finally forced to hear. Was this a case of revenge masked as justice? Or the unveiling of a hidden predator whose power had shielded him from scrutiny for decades? Behind the walls of Hollywood's most protected palaces, what really happened between David Geffen and the man who now accuses him of exploitation? On paper, they couldn't have been more different. One was a titan of industry, a cultural icon molded by decades of strategic brilliance and ruthless ambition. The other was a former foster child, a man navigating survival, identity, and self-worth in a world built to ignore people like him. David Geffen, born in Brooklyn in 1943, built his empire from the ground up. He discovered legends, broke records, and eventually helped shape the entire landscape of American entertainment. Reserved, guarded, and known for maintaining tight control over both his business and personal affairs, Geffen had a reputation for privacy until now. He was not flashy in public, but among insiders, he commanded loyalty, fear, and admiration in equal measure. His wealth was staggering, his influence even more so. To some, he was the American dream personified. To others, a man who always got exactly what he wanted. David Armstrong, who went by the name Donovan Michaels, had no such legacy to protect. Born into the foster care system, his early life was marred by instability, neglect, and a constant search for belonging. By his 20s, Michaels had turned to platforms like Seeking.com, where companionship and financial stability could be negotiated in discreet digital contracts. He wasn't naive. He knew what he was getting into, but he didn't expect to be consumed by it. Michaels alleges that Geffen first contacted him in 2019, offering $10,000 for a single night. But that night extended into weeks, then months, then years. Soon, he was a permanent fixture on Geffen's super yacht, a silent shadow at glamorous events, and eventually his husband. The man who had once sold his time now found himself in a different kind of transaction, one cloaked in promises of love, loyalty, and partnership. But Michaels claims the reality was darker. He says Geffen systematically discouraged his independence, told him not to waste time pursuing a modeling career, and instead convinced him to dedicate himself entirely to Geffen's world. The oral agreement, according to Michaels, was clear. They were life partners now, and he would be financially supported in perpetuity. What Michaels saw as love, Geffen's legal team now denies ever existed in contractual form. There was no prenup, no signatures, only words spoken in private, behind the closed doors of luxury. This vast imbalance in power, history, and social capital forms the foundation of the lawsuit. Michaels paints himself as someone groomed not just sexually, but psychologically and emotionally. Geffen, by contrast, appears as a man whose empire allowed him to rewrite the terms of intimacy at will. The question then becomes, was Donovan Michaels a willing partner swept into a world he couldn't maintain, or a vulnerable man manipulated by one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood? There were no bruises, no broken bones, no blood on the marble floors of any Beverly Hills estate. But if the allegations are to be believed, what happened behind the walls of David Geffen's luxurious empire was no less violent. Only the wounds were psychological, the control invisible, and the weapon, power itself. According to Donovan Michaels, the abuse didn't begin with yelling or threats. It began with access. Access to wealth, safety, prestige, and eventually emotional leverage. He describes it not as a relationship, but as an escalating transaction, where emotional availability was rewarded and autonomy was punished. The lawsuit lays it out starkly. Geffen, then 80, found Michaels through Seeking.com, a platform known for transactional companionships. Michaels was 27. After an initial $10,000 offer for one night, the arrangement quickly turned into a standing contract, unwritten, yet unmistakably understood. Monthly payments followed. So did extravagant trips, VIP galas, and a front-row seat to the lives of billionaires. But always with an unspoken rule. Obedience was expected. Resistance was punished not with violence, but with withdrawal. Michaels alleges that he was pulled into a carefully curated psychological environment. Geffen discouraged him from earning his own income, calling his modeling aspirations a waste of time. Instead, Michaels claims he was instructed to become Geffen's full-time emotional caretaker, social companion, house manager, and sexual partner. But this was not love, Michaels contends. It was entrapment. And beneath the luxury, there were fractures. Michaels states that Geffen often showcased him like a trophy to his elite inner circle, referring to him as someone he had rescued from poverty and sex work. During social visits, the lawsuit reads, Geffen regularly bragged to his friends, including celebrities and media moguls, that Michaels had a very difficult childhood and that Geffen had saved his life. To many, it might have sounded generous, even noble. But to Michaels, it was a recurring humiliation, a way of branding him as damaged goods made whole by proximity to Geffen, a passive participant in his own narrative. Michaels also claims that drug use was normalized in their social environment. He says Geffen offered him cocaine the very first night they met, and that on their yacht, cruising through the Mediterranean or anchored at Cannes, cocaine and MDMA flowed freely among Geffen's guests. Michaels, who later enrolled in a 12-step sobriety program, describes this atmosphere as both intoxicating and destructive. But the most harrowing allegations concern what happened behind bedroom doors. Michaels claims that Geffen exerted sexual dominance in ways that left him physically injured. While he doesn't describe graphic acts in the lawsuit, the language implies coercion, degradation, and lasting trauma. What makes this case chilling is the lack of traditional violence. There is no physical evidence, no photographs, no hospital records. Instead, there is testimony about psychological decay, the slow erosion of Michaels' sense of self, masked as luxury and love. Eventually, Michaels says he tried to regain some independence. He joined a sobriety program. He expressed a desire to grow. But when he began asserting boundaries, everything changed. According to Michaels, Geffen responded with fury. While attending Jeff Bezos' wedding in Venice in 2024, Geffen allegedly ordered Michaels to vacate their New York apartment immediately. The man who once promised him lifetime support now left him with nothing, no money, no property, no legal claim. Their marriage had no prenup. Their verbal agreement wasn't written. And Michaels says he was suddenly, irrevocably, alone. The timing was brutal. Geffen had filed for divorce just weeks earlier. Michaels alleges that this lawsuit wasn't retaliation but desperation. He had no income, no assets, and the man he had served for years now denied that any agreement, even oral, had ever existed. The lawsuit lays out 6 legal claims: breach of oral contract, breach of implied contract, quantum meruit, meaning compensation for services rendered without formal agreement, and requests for declaratory relief from the court. Michaels did not name a specific dollar figure. He claims he needs full financial disclosure from Geffen, to determine the extent of the support he's owed. For Geffen's part, the response was scathing. His legal team called the claims false and pathetic, denying any form of contractual obligation, written or otherwise. They argue that no valid agreement expressed or implied was ever formed. Still, the underlying story has captivated the public because it doesn't play by the rules of traditional domestic abuse. There are no fists thrown, no restraining orders, only a whispered promise, a missing prenup, and the word of one man against another. What makes this crime so disturbing isn't whether a law was broken, but whether trust itself was weaponized. This wasn't impulsive. A former civil litigator commented when reviewing the suit. If true, this was calculated, sustained control masquerading as affection. So what exactly happened between the richest man in Hollywood and the man who once called him a savior? And in a world where love can be bought, borrowed, or threatened, where is the line between consent and control? In the realm of civil litigation, the battlefield is not lined with caution tape, but with depositions, subpoenas, and razor-sharp arguments. And when billions of dollars hang in the balance, every sentence in a lawsuit becomes a potential landmine. David Geffen's legal troubles did not begin in a courtroom. They began with a 33-page complaint filed by attorney Brian J. Friedman, known for representing Hollywood elites in high-stakes disputes. The document wasn't just a legal filing. It was a narrative, a meticulously constructed accusation of grooming, coercion, and betrayal, wrapped in the language of contracts and compensation. From the outset, the strategy was clear. Michaels positioned himself not as a gold digger, but as a victim of a billionaire's psychological machinery. His legal team outlined 6 causes of action, each hinging on a fragile but provocative claim that Geffen had made binding oral promises of lifelong support in exchange for services that went far beyond companionship. These services were not transactional in the traditional sense, Michaels argued. They included emotional labor, house management, constant companionship, travel coordination, health consulting, and support for Geffen's social and political ambitions. In effect, Michaels portrayed himself as a full-time unpaid spouse who gave up his own career at Geffen's request. But there was no contract, no witness, no written proof. Just conversations, many of them private, some of them years old. Geffen's legal team pounced. Their opening salvo was not just a denial, but a direct attack on the lawsuit's legitimacy. In a statement to the Los Angeles Times, Geffen's attorney Patty Glazer wrote, "There was no contract express, written, oral, or implied that has ever existed. We will be vigorously and righteously defending against this false, pathetic lawsuit." What followed was a preview of the legal war to come. Geffen's lawyers are expected to file motions to dismiss, arguing that even if every claim Michaels made were true, they would still not meet the legal threshold for enforceable contracts under California law. One of their strongest weapons? The statute of frauds, a legal principle requiring certain agreements, especially those involving large sums of money or real property, to be in writing. Under that standard, an oral agreement promising lifelong financial support, especially one involving shared property and assets, would likely be deemed unenforceable. Legal analysts also expect a barrage of motions to strike, challenging the complaint as emotionally manipulative and legally deficient. The goal is simple: discredit not just the case, but the man bringing it. Michaels' side, in turn, is likely to demand financial discovery, including access to Geffen's bank records, property holdings, and communications. In the context of divorce and civil suits, this phase is intrusive, exhaustive, and dangerous for someone with a public image to protect. Every email, text message, and transaction could become evidence. And then there's the question of motive. Critics argue that Michaels filed the lawsuit as leverage in the divorce, possibly to embarrass Geffen or secure a better financial settlement. Even veteran attorneys have commented on the theatricality of the complaint, describing it as reading more like a novel than a legal brief. But regardless of motive, the courts must now grapple with the core issue. Can love, dependency, and psychological influence be quantified in legal terms? The civil suit, while separate from the divorce proceedings, may intertwine with them. California law treats all assets acquired during marriage as community property, unless a prenup says otherwise. In this case, there is none. That fact alone could make Geffen's vast fortune vulnerable. Yet, without clear documentation or corroborating testimony, Michaels' claims stand on a knife's edge. It's a classic, he said, but with legal implications that could redefine the boundaries of emotional contracts in the age of influence. The investigation here isn't about physical evidence. It's about credibility, intent, and perception, and whether the court is willing to believe that power in this case was a silent form of coercion. The courtroom wasn't packed with paparazzi, nor was it broadcast on live television. But what unfolded inside was nothing short of a Hollywood legal drama, just without the cameras. In one corner stood David Geffen's legal juggernaut, a team of seasoned litigators known for making lawsuits disappear before they ever make headlines. In the other, a younger, quieter team representing Donovan Michaels, carrying a complaint that could either be laughed out of court or make history. The opening statements set the tone. Michaels' attorney, Brian J. Friedman, spoke first. His voice was measured, but every word cut with precision. This case is not about money. It's about promises made then shattered, about power used to isolate, manipulate, and erase a human being who was once loved and then discarded. Geffen's team didn't flinch. Patty Glazer, sharp as ever, rose and delivered her counter. This is not a case of abuse. This is a case of entitlement. Mr. Michaels lived like a billionaire for years without earning it. And now, having been told no, he seeks to retroactively assign meaning to a relationship that was never contractual, never binding, and never balanced. The heart of the trial hinged on a central legal contradiction. Was there ever a valid agreement between the two men? And if so, was it enforceable? Friedman presented a timeline of interactions messages, calendar entries, photos, and even voice memos, arguing that Geffen had repeatedly reaffirmed his verbal commitment to support Michaels for life. Though there was no prenup, he contended, there was a pattern of behavior that constituted an oral contract. But Glazer wasn't fazed. She reminded the court of California's statute of frauds, which requires certain types of agreements, especially those involving financial support or real estate, to be in writing. Words whispered in the privacy of a Malibu estate do not amount to a legal obligation, she told the judge. One of the pivotal moments came when Michaels took the stand. He didn't cry. He didn't posture. He described life inside Geffen's world with eerie calm, the silencing luxury, the emotional dependence, the subtle reminders that everything he had could be taken away in an instant. He admitted to accepting money, to performing emotional labor, to leaving behind his personal aspirations. But he also testified that Geffen had assured him, on multiple occasions, that their relationship had evolved beyond the transactional. When asked why he never insisted on a written contract, Michaels replied, "Because I believed him, because we were married." But that, too, was a point of contention. Glazer argued that the marriage, though legally recognized, didn't retroactively legitimize prior transactions, nor did it entitle Michaels to assets unless legally outlined. She painted him as a man who had confused access with ownership and affection with entitlement. In a sharp cross-examination, Geffen's lawyers pressed Michaels on inconsistencies. Why had he remained in the relationship so long if he felt abused? Why didn't he document the agreement? Was this really about harm or leverage? The tension peaked when Geffen's team introduced evidence that Michaels had discussed writing a memoir months before the lawsuit, raising questions about motive, timing, and publicity. But Friedman countered with testimony from a former House employee who claimed to have overheard Geffen refer to Michaels as his partner for life and tell staff to treat him accordingly. While not conclusive, it gave the jury a reason to pause. Both sides filed motions, some granted, some denied. The judge, pragmatic and reserved, was cautious not to allow spectacle to overtake substance. No single piece of evidence sealed the case. Instead, it became a battle of narratives, one man insisting on promises and emotional enslavement, the other denying obligation and asserting that love, even when sincere, does not come with a price tag. The jury was left with a question no contract could answer. When power and intimacy collide, what counts as coercion and what counts as consent? At first glance, this case may appear to be about broken promises and missing prenups. But beneath the legal jargon lies a more haunting question. What happens when intimacy is engineered by power? To understand that, we must look at the men behind the headlines, not as plaintiff and defendant, but as psychological profiles caught in a quietly violent dynamic. David Geffen, now in his 80s, has long been considered one of the most brilliant power brokers in modern American history. He is not flamboyant in public, but those close to him describe him as highly calculated, deeply private, and exceptionally strategic. A man whose very life was built on control of companies, narratives, talent, and environments. Psychologically, Geffen fits the profile of a dominant, high-status controller, someone who surrounds himself with people who can either be leveraged or curated. His relationships, both professional and personal, have been characterized by asymmetry. He gives access, wealth, and status. In return, loyalty is expected, often silently. But control doesn't always come in the form of demands. In relationships like this, it often comes dressed as protection. Affection is conditional. Autonomy is gently eroded. And over time, the recipient may begin to question whether their value lies in who they are or in what they provide emotionally, sexually, or socially. This is where Donovan Michaels comes into focus. A man with no stable family, no generational wealth, and no societal safety net. Michaels entered adulthood with a survival mindset. His history in the foster care system suggests exposure to instability, a constant search for validation, and likely attachment insecurity traits often exploited in asymmetrical relationships. Michaels wasn't naive. He knew what platforms like Seeking.com were for. But what began as a transactional connection, clear, simple, and compensated, morphed into something murky. Geffen allegedly blurred the lines. No longer just a sugar arrangement, but a partnership. No longer a transaction, but a life together. Yet the structure never changed. Michaels didn't gain financial independence. He didn't sign contracts protecting his future. He became emotionally, socially, and economically tethered to someone whose resources were infinite and whose affection could be revoked with a single command. This psychological tethering is not unique to this case. In fact, forensic psychologists call it dependency-based grooming, a slow, calculated process of building emotional loyalty while removing all other avenues of support. It often begins with praise, evolves into generosity, then matures into subtle control. And when the subject tries to break free, they are left disoriented, isolated, and most importantly, discredited. Critics of Michaels argue that he knew what he was doing, that he benefited enormously from the relationship, and that this lawsuit is a cynical attempt to extract more. And yet, psychological harm doesn't always correlate with visible abuse. In environments like this, the trauma is silent, the erosion invisible, the suffering muted by luxury. Is Michaels a calculating opportunist or a deeply conditioned dependent? Is Geffen a predator exploiting systemic power imbalances? Or simply a man whose version of love couldn't escape the gravity of his own wealth? These questions cannot be answered with certainty, but they do raise a deeper ethical dilemma. What are the moral limits of influence in a relationship where one party has everything and the other, nothing? If Michaels had been a woman young, financially dependent, and emotionally isolated, would the public perception be different? If Geffen were not a media titan, but a middle-class man making similar promises, would this still be seen as a pathetic lawsuit or as a cry for recognition? Perhaps the most disturbing element of this case is not whether Geffen broke a contract, but whether he ever believed Michaels was capable of leaving. And perhaps the real crime isn't what was done, but what was systematically never allowed to become real. As the case enters its next phase, the courtroom battles may quiet down, but the questions it raised are only beginning to echo beyond the legal system. At stake now is not just a judgment of liability, but a broader reckoning over wealth, intimacy, and accountability in the modern age. Legal experts expect a prolonged fight. Geffen's attorneys are likely to file a scorched earth motion to dismiss, attacking both the structure and credibility of the complaint. If that fails, a motion for summary judgment could follow, arguing that the case lacks the legal foundation to proceed to trial. Michaels' team, meanwhile, is expected to press for discovery, an invasive process that could pull back the curtain on decades of Geffen's private communications, financial records, and interpersonal dynamics. If the case survives these early legal maneuvers, it may not go to trial. In high-profile disputes involving the ultra-wealthy, settlements are often negotiated quietly, not for guilt, but for discretion. Geffen may decide that protecting his legacy is worth a private deal. Or he may choose to fight, setting a precedent that emotional labor, however real, has no legal price tag without a contract. For Michaels, the road forward is uncertain. He may win compensation. He may be dismissed as an opportunist, or he may quietly disappear from the spotlight, once again his name remembered only in connection with the man who allegedly tried to erase him. In the public sphere, however, the damage has already rippled outward. Media coverage has been polarized. Some call Michaels courageous for speaking out about a dynamic feud dare to name. Others accuse him of manipulation, using public sympathy as currency. Social media, predictably, has turned both men into archetypes: one, the lonely billionaire afraid of love; the other, the beautiful, dependent with nothing left to lose. But this story is not just about two men. It's about how we, as a society, fail to define where control ends and consent begins, especially when power is disguised as generosity and vulnerability is mistaken for weakness. There will be no easy verdict here, no dramatic gavel slam, just a slow unraveling of perception, one interview, one leak, one headline at a time. And maybe that's the true legacy of this case. Not whether David Geffen owes Donovan Michaels a fortune, but whether we're willing to admit that coercion doesn't always scream at whispers. In the language of dependency, luxury, and silence. Because sometimes justice doesn't live in the courtroom, it hides in what we fear to believe is true. We often think of abuse as something loud, shouting, violence, visible scars. But sometimes it hides behind silk sheets and champagne flutes, whispered in promises made in private, never written down. This case forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Can love ever be real when one person holds all the money, the power, and the options, while the other has nothing but hope? What happens when dependency is disguised as romance, when silence is mistaken for consent, and when emotional labor is performed without recognition, in exchange for a lifestyle that can be ripped away overnight? Whether you believe Donovan Michaels is a victim or an opportunist, his story shines a light on the grayest corners of human relationships, where manipulation doesn't look like a fist, but like a favor, followed by another and another. As the legal battle unfolds, we may never get a verdict that feels satisfying, but maybe the real courtroom is here among us, in how we talk about power, intimacy, and accountability. So now, we turn to you. Do you think there was exploitation or just heartbreak? Was this love or leverage? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts might be the most honest judgment of all.